In the autumn of 1958, word reached Carl Hubbell that Mel Ott had died after a car accident outside New Orleans. Hubbell rarely spoke to reporters about anything at all, and on most days he preferred silence to almost any quote. He had spent 16 years standing beside Ott in the same clubhouse, through a pennant, through a championship, and through several losing seasons, and in all that time he had almost nothing to say in public. But that week he broke the habit. He said one sentence that quietly contradicted a phrase already stitched to his former teammate's name across a decade of New York sports pages. Writers had spent 10 years repeating that nice guys finish last, and somehow Mel Ott had become the example everyone reached for first. Hubbell did not raise his voice when he answered. He simply said the record did not support the phrase. The harder question was why anyone had needed convincing in the first place. Gretna, Louisiana, 1925. Mel Ott was 16 years old and had never played one inning of organized professional baseball, not in the minor leagues, not in any league above sandlot ball near his hometown outside New Orleans. Players did not jump from a Louisiana schoolyard directly into a National League pennant race. It was simply not done, not in 1925, and not for decades afterward. But Giants manager John McGraw watched him take batting practice for 10 minutes and refused to send him anywhere else, despite a roster already built for contention that season. Scouts and beat writers who heard about the decision called it reckless, even careless for a franchise trying to win immediately. Ott swung with an exaggerated leg kick, his front foot lifting high before every pitch landed, a motion considered unteachable and structurally unsound by the hitting theory of the era. McGraw's reasoning was simple and was quoted for decades afterward. He said he did not want anyone tinkering with that natural swing, full stop, no further explanation offered to anyone who asked. So Ott sat on the Giants bench for 2 full seasons, watching from the dugout instead of developing in the minors the way every comparable prospect did, an arrangement almost unheard of for a teenager at that level of competition. By 1929, at 20 years old, he hit 42 home runs and drove in 151 runs, both records at the time for a player that young, while batting over 300. 3 years later, at 22, he reached 100 career home runs, the youngest player in National League history to do it. The leg kick scouts had mocked was now the most feared swing in the league. Nobody questioned the mechanics anymore. They were only trying to find a way to get him out, and increasingly, almost nobody could manage it. Giants owner Charles Stoneham later said Ott was the best-looking young player at bat he had seen in 24 years running the franchise. A comment that carried weight coming from a man who had watched hundreds of prospects pass through that same clubhouse and fail. By 1948, Leo Durocher had taken over as manager of the New York Giants, inheriting a job Ott had held for 7 seasons without ever finishing higher than 3rd place. Durocher had built pennant-winning rosters elsewhere on confrontation, on players he pushed and sometimes embarrassed into producing more. And he would go on to win a championship of his own with the Giants just a few years later. He viewed Ott's gentler tenure through that exact lens. The charge against him, repeated for decades and eventually compressed into 4 words that outran every statistic he ever produced, was that Ott was simply too kind to win at the highest level of the sport. A manager who never raised his voice, the argument went, could not demand enough from a clubhouse to carry it anywhere meaningful in October. It was not an empty accusation built on nothing real. The Giants under Ott posted a winning record only 3 times across 7 seasons, and the war had pulled able-bodied players off the roster for several of those years, thinning a lineup that had once carried a champion to a title in 1933. Durocher was not wrong about the won and lost columns sitting in front of him every morning. He was wrong about what had actually produced them. He measured leadership in volume, in how loudly a room could be controlled from the dugout. And Ott had spent 20 years proving he never needed volume to be heard by the men who actually played beside him every single day of the season. The 2 men had almost nothing in common as leaders, and the contrast between them became the lens through which an entire era of Giants baseball would later be judged. Hubbell never argued with Durocher in public, not once, not in print, not even when asked directly by reporters looking for a clean and controversial quote. He did not need to. When younger writers eventually asked him about the phrase attached to his former teammate, he gave the same answer almost every time: a small, private memory instead of a rebuttal anyone could print as fresh controversy. After the worst losses, the kind that emptied a clubhouse into total silence for an hour or more, Ott did not shout at anyone involved in the mistake. He pulled a chair toward whichever player had made the costly error, sat down across from him, and walked through the at-bat or the misplayed ball pitch by pitch, calmly, without assigning blame to a single person in the room that night. Younger players sometimes mistook this for softness before they fully understood what it actually was. Hubbell had been in that exact room from 1928 until 1943, 16 seasons beside him. Longer than any other teammate who ever wore that uniform across that stretch of years, and he remained the only man left who had watched the pattern repeat often enough across that many seasons to know it was deliberate rather than convenient or accidental. He once said privately that he never once saw Ott blame a pitcher for a loss in all those years, not a single time, regardless of how badly the game had gone. Have you ever watched someone get underestimated for the very quality that actually made them effective? Tell us what you saw in the comments below. Fred Lindstrom, a teammate from Ott's earliest seasons and a future Hall of Famer in his own right, admitted years later that his first impression of the young outfielder had been completely wrong. He assumed the heavier build and the quiet manner meant Ott would never make the jump to major league pitching at the speed the position demanded of him every day. Through what Lindstrom later described as constant, almost stubborn work, that early assumption collapsed entirely within a single season of watching him play. That gap between first impression and eventual reality followed Ott for the rest of his career, in ways most fans watching from the stands never noticed at all. The public saw a player so universally liked that even Brooklyn fans, among the most hostile crowds in baseball at the time, cheered him at Ebbets Field whenever he stepped to the plate against their own team. What the public rarely saw was the discipline required to stay that composed for 22 consecutive seasons without one recorded incident of him losing control in front of his own team. Teammates eventually started calling him Master Melvin, a nickname that began as gentle teasing about his calm and ended as genuine respect for the same quality. He led the National League in on-base plus slugging twice during his career, a number that barely existed as a statistic during his playing days but confirms decades later exactly how dominant the quiet approach actually was. Calm, in Ott's case, was never the absence of intensity. It was simply his specific private version of it, built and maintained pitch after pitch, season after season, for over 2 decades without interruption. There is a number that ends most arguments before they start: 511 home runs. When Mel Ott retired in 1947, only 2 men in the history of baseball had hit more. One was Babe Ruth. The other was Jimmy Fox. Ott was the first National League player to ever cross 500, in a league that had watched him for 22 years and still treated his swing as a curiosity. 323 of those home runs came inside a single ballpark. The Polo Grounds, with its absurdly short right field porch, became less a coincidence and more a weapon Ott learned to wield with precision. No player in the history of that stadium hit more home runs there than he did, and none ever will, because the building itself no longer exists. It is a number frozen in time, attached permanently to a man Leo Durocher once suggested did not have enough fight in him to win. Consider the age. Ott signed with the Giants at 16 years old. He played his first major league game at 17. He never spent a single inning in the minor leagues. Not one game, not one bus ride through a town nobody remembers. Almost every great hitter of his era served an apprenticeship somewhere quiet before the major leagues let them in. Ott skipped that apprenticeship entirely, because John McGraw decided the swing was finished before the boy was. By the time he turned 22, he had become the youngest player in National League history to reach 100 home runs. He would also become the youngest to reach 1,000 hits and 1,000 runs batted in, marks that stood for decades after younger, faster men came and went. These were not numbers built on a single hot season. They were built across 22 years with one team, in one city, without a single trade, without a single year wearing another uniform. Here is what makes the case against Durocher difficult to sustain. A man without competitive fire does not last 22 seasons in the same lineup against the same league, that keeps adjusting to stop him. A man without fight does not get walked more than 1,700 times in his career, a number that means pitchers spent 2 decades more afraid of his bat than confident in their own. Fear is not something pitchers offer to a man they consider soft. Durocher built his entire philosophy on the idea that kindness and winning could not coexist in the same man. He never had to explain why Mel Ott, the kindest player in either league according to nearly everyone who shared a clubhouse with him, also became the most feared power hitter the National League had produced up to that point. The numbers did not ask Durocher's permission to exist. They simply sat there, season after season, contradicting him in silence the same way Ott always did. Ott never publicly corrected the phrase that attached itself permanently to his name for the rest of his life and beyond it. Its actual origin was a sports writer's paraphrase, not Durocher's exact recorded words, but Ott let the shortened, sharper version travel without objection for the remainder of his life and career. He had spent 22 seasons quietly proving that calm and competitive were never opposites, yet that 4-word phrase outran every statistic he had ever produced on the field across 2 full decades of play. Friends close to him later said he found the whole episode mildly amusing rather than insulting, which in its own way proved the exact point Durocher had missed about him from the start. By November of 1958, Ott was 49 years old, working as a broadcaster, decades removed from the criticism over his managing record, when the car accident outside New Orleans left him hospitalized for nearly a week before his death. He never got the opportunity to settle the argument himself, in his own words, on his own terms, while the people repeating the phrase were still around to actually hear it from him. The defense was left entirely to the men who had actually shared a clubhouse with him for years, and most of them, true to character, said almost nothing publicly either. Carl Hubbell carried that defense the longest, 16 years of proximity giving him the only real standing to deliver it convincingly to anyone who finally asked. When reporters in 1958 asked him to respond to the idea that kindness had cost Ott a championship somewhere along the way, Hubbell offered the same memory he always gave. The quiet chair pulled up after a bad loss, the absence of blame, the discipline almost nobody outside that room had ever actually witnessed firsthand across 16 full seasons. He never raised his voice while saying it, which was itself the entire point he was making to anyone listening closely enough to notice. Mel Ott led the National League in home runs 6 times, reached 511 before nearly anyone else in his league's long history, and did every bit of it without becoming what Leo Durocher believed a winner absolutely had to be. Nice guys finish last was never a fact. It was a sentence that outlived the man it was supposedly written about, until the people who actually knew him finally said otherwise, decades too late for him to hear it himself. Mel Ott never finished last. He simply finished kind. 3 decades after Hubbell delivered that defense, in 1988, he died following injuries from a fall outside his own car, an echo of the very accident that had taken Ott in 1958, as if the 2 men who had spent 16 seasons side by side were never quite finished standing together. If this story moved you, leave a like. It helps stories like this one reach more people who never heard them before today. Tell us in the comments which legend you think deserves a defense like this one. Share it with someone who loves the history of this game. And if you want to see the next story of a quiet competitor history misjudged, that video is waiting next.